Welcome back to the deep dive.
Where we like to really dig deep into the big ideas that are, shaping our world.
And the stuff that people are actually thinking about and talking about,
Right.
but maybe not, fully understanding or...
Not getting the full story, like
Right.
beneath the headlines kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And today we're going to be looking at Good Economics for Hard Times.
Yes.
Which is a book by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo.
Two very famous economists.
Yes. And Nobel Prize winners.
Yes.
And, these are people who have, spent decades and decades studying poverty in developing countries.
Right.
And in this book, they kind of turn their attention...
The richer nations?
The richer nations, yeah, exactly.
The U.S. and places like that.
And one of the things that they find is that a lot of these problems that we tend to think of as unique to developed countries, they actually see kind of similar trends in the developing world.
Yeah, and it's kind of a crisis of trust in government.
Yeah.
And institutions.
Yeah, feeling left behind.
Rising inequality.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that they try to do is they say that they want to be hard-headed about the facts. They want to be skeptical of slick answers and magic bullets.
Right.
And just really honest about what we know and what we don't know.
Right.
So let's jump into some of the specific topics that they cover in the book.
Okay.
And maybe we can start with immigration because that's...
Yeah, a hot button issue.
Yeah, it is. And they actually call this like the seductive syllogism.
Right.
Which is that, the idea is that more immigrants equals lower wages equals worse outcomes for everyone.
For everyone who's already there.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of seems like basic supply and demand, right?
On the surface, it does.
Yeah. But then they really dig into some of the evidence and it gets a lot more complicated.
It does. And one of the things that they point out is that our perceptions about how many immigrants there are often really, really wrong.
Yeah, wildly inaccurate. They give this example from a survey across 6 different countries: France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US.
Right.
And I think in Italy, people thought that immigrants made up 26% of the population.
Wow.
But it was actually only 10%.
So more than double.
Yeah, more than double. So, I mean, that's a pretty huge...
It is.
This perception.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that they give this example of a politician whose support actually went up after her statements about immigration were fact-checked.
Really?
Like, she was shown to have been lying,
Yeah.
essentially, but it actually didn't matter.
So it's almost like the narrative is more powerful than the facts.
Exactly.
So if it's not just, simple economists driving everyone's views on immigration,
Right.
what else is going on?
Right.
Like, why do people actually migrate?
Well, they talk about how it's not just about sort of escaping extreme poverty like we might think.
Right.
It's often because of like a collapse of everyday normality. Right. So, violence or civil war or just the unpredictability of, living in a place where, there might be, drug wars or something going on.
Yeah, so it's just like a lack of basic
Safety and security. Yeah.
And they give this example from a study in Nepal where they found that like agricultural hardship didn't really lead to people leaving, but violence did.
Right.
So when there was like a big increase in violence from the Maoist insurgency, then you saw people leaving, and they have this line where they say, they were running from the mouth of the shark.
Right.
Pretty vivid imagery.
It is.
But then they also have this really interesting example from the Westman Islands in Iceland where there was a volcanic eruption.
Right.
And they found that actually this natural disaster ended up being good for some of the people who were displaced.
Yeah.
Specifically the younger people.
So the people who were under 25 when this happened ended up earning more later in life.
And it's because they had to kind of, move and find new opportunities. And
yeah, they were sort of forced to reevaluate their, career paths. And
yeah, they were forced out of their comfort zone.
Right.
But then they also point out that even when people have information about opportunities and they even have help to migrate, they don't always do it.
Right.
So they have this experiment in Bangladesh during the manga, which is like the lean season before the rice harvest. And they gave people information about jobs in the city and even money to cover the cost of travel.
Wow.
But still not everyone migrated.
So it's not just about a lack of awareness or a lack of resources.
Exactly.
There's something else going on.
Okay, so one of the things that we talked about at the beginning was this idea that, more immigrants equals lower wages.
Right.
But then they talk about this concept called the demand channel.
Right.
And how that can actually kind of offset some of those negative effects.
So the basic idea is that when immigrants come in, they start spending money.
Right.
And that creates demand for goods and services.
Right. They're buying groceries, they're, renting apartments, they're...
They need haircuts, they need transportation.
Yeah. And all of that creates jobs.
Right.
But then they give this example of Czech workers commuting into Germany.
Uh-huh.
And in that case, they actually did see some negative effects on native employment.
And it's because those Czech workers were commuting back to the Czech Republic to spend most of their money.
So the demand channel wasn't really working in Germany.
Right.
So that's kind of a key point, that it's not just about how many immigrants come in.
Right.
It's also about how they participate in the economy.
Exactly, how they integrate.
Yeah. And another thing that they talk about is why employers don't just automatically replace native-born workers with immigrants who might be willing to work for lower wages.
Right.
And it's because of this concept called efficiency wages, which is basically the idea that it's more efficient for employers to pay their existing workers a little bit more than the absolute minimum they would accept.
Right. Because it reduces turnover. It keeps people motivated and productive.
You don't have to constantly be training new people.
Right.
And, there's a certain amount of trust that builds up with your existing workforce.
And then, of course, there's also the fact that, immigrants often end up in jobs that native-born workers just don't want.
Right, or in places where there aren't a lot of, native-born workers who are looking for jobs.
And they also talk about skilled migration and how that's a little bit different.
Right.
Because there's actually a possibility that highly skilled immigrants could undercut the wages of native-born workers.
Because they might not be, demanding those higher efficiency wages.
Right. And they might be willing to, work for a little bit less just to get their foot in the door.
To get that experience.
And then they talk about the importance of connections for migrants.
Right.
And how, having relatives or friends or co-ethnics in a place can really help them to find jobs and to find housing and to adjust to the new environment.
Yeah, and they talk about Kai von Munchi's work on Mexican migrants.
Right.
Which really shows how important those networks are.
Exactly.
But it's not just about economic incentives, right?
Right.
There are also these psychological barriers to migration.
Right.
And they talk about the difference between uncertainty and risk, and how people are often very averse to loss.
Right.
So they're reluctant to give up what they have, even if there's a potential for something better.
Yeah, it's like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, even if the devil you know is not that great.
Yeah. And then they also talk about how the high cost of living in some cities can actually negate the wage advantage for lower skilled migrants.
Right. So you might be making more money, but you're also paying a lot more for everything.
Yeah. So they give this example of like a lawyer versus a janitor moving from the Deep South to New York City.
And the lawyer comes out way ahead, but the janitor actually ends up worse off.
Yeah, because of the housing costs.
Right.
And that kind of ties into the issue of zoning regulations.
Right.
And how those can make it really hard to build more affordable housing. And then they also talk about the importance of family as a safety net, and how, if you move to a new city, you might not have that same support system if you lose your job. Or, you get evicted or something like that.
Right. You don't have your family to fall back on.
And finally, they talk about some of the initiatives that are trying to bring jobs to distressed areas.
Right.
Things like the rise of the rest. But they kind of point out that these are often money-making ventures for private investors.
Yeah.
So it's not always clear that they're actually going to benefit the communities that they're supposed to help.
Right. And it's really hard to just sort of pick up an industry and move it somewhere else. Like those clusters that we were talking about, they tend to be very sticky.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's immigration.
Right.
Let's move on to another really interesting and controversial topic, which is trade.
Yes.
And we saw recently with President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, there's a lot of disagreement among economists about whether those tariffs actually helped or hurt the economy.
Right.
The IGM Booth panel, which surveys a bunch of top economists, show that most of them were against those tariffs. But then you have people like Paul Krugman and Greg Mankind, who are both very respected economists.
Yeah, on opposite sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, and they both generally support trade.
Yeah.
So it's a really complicated issue.
It is.
And it kind of goes back to this idea comparative advantage.
Right.
Which is basically the idea that countries should specialize in what they're good at.
Right.
And trade with each other to get the things that they're not good at.
Right. So it's kind of like if you're really good at making shoes and I'm really good at making bread,
right,
then we should just focus on making those things and trade with each other.
Instead of trying to, make both things ourselves.
Right.
And that can lead to, an increase in overall GNP.
Uh-huh.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone wins.
Right.
And they talk about Paul Samuelson's work, which shows that, there can be winners and losers from trade.
Right.
And then they give the example of India's economic reforms in 1991, and how there's a debate about whether those reforms actually caused the economic growth that followed.
Right, because it's hard to know what would have happened if they hadn't won those reforms.
Right.
And they were also doing a bunch of other reforms at the same time.
Yeah, so it's really hard to isolate the effect of trade.
It is.
And then they talk about the relationship between trade and inequality. And there's actually some mixed evidence on that.
Yeah. There's an IMF staff report that suggests that trade might lead to more equality.
Okay.
But they also say that that might only be true in certain circumstances, like
right, yeah.
in Europe.
And then they also talk about how in some developing countries, trade liberalization has actually led to lower wages for low-skilled workers.
Which is not what you would expect based on the theory.
Right.
So it's another example of how the real world is more complicated than the models.
Yeah, exactly.
But then they also talk about some of the positive effects of trade liberalization.
Okay.
Like in India, they talk about how firms were forced to become more productive.
Okay.
And they started introducing new products and using better inputs.
So it kind of forced them to up their game.
Right.
But then they also talk about how it can be really hard for new players to enter the world of international trade.
Right.
Because reputation is so important.
Right.
So if you're a small company in Egypt trying to sell carpets, it's going to be really hard to compete with the big established brands because people don't know you.
Yeah. They don't know if they can trust you.
They don't trust you. Yeah, and they talk about the Indian software industry.
Okay.
And how they had to really work hard to build that trust and reputation.
Right.
And then they talk about the stickiness of labor, which is basically the idea that, people don't just move from one job to another or from one place to another that easily.
Especially if they have families and homes and, communities that they're attached to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they talk about industrial clusters and how those can be really beneficial for trade.
So they give examples like Tirupur in India for knitwear, or Zili in China for children's wear, or even biotech in Boston.
Okay.
So these are places where there's a whole bunch of companies that are all doing the same kind of thing.
Right.
And they benefit from being close to each other.
So it's like a network effect.
Exactly.
And then they talk about China's exchange rate policy and how they intentionally kept their currency weak to make their exports cheaper.
Right.
And that led to them accumulating a lot of foreign reserves, but it also created some imbalances in the global economy.
Right.
And then they talk about the China shock in the United States.
And how that led to a lot of job losses in manufacturing, especially in certain regions.
And those jobs didn't really come back.
Right.
And then they talk about how the gains from trade for the U.S. might actually be relatively small.
Compared to other countries.
Yeah.
And that's because the U.S. is a very large economy, and it doesn't import that much stuff relative to its size.
And then they talk about historical attempts at autarky.
Right.
Which is basically like trying to be completely self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And they point out that those attempts have generally failed.
Yeah, it's really hard to do.
And then finally, they talk about the challenges faced by older workers who are displaced by trade.
Right.
And how, it can be really hard for them to retrain and find new jobs.
Especially if their skills are very specific to the industry that they were working in.
Yeah, and they even suggest a policy idea, which is to give tax breaks to firms that hire older workers in trade-affected regions.
Right.
So it's really interesting how they kind of bring it back to the human element.
Right.
And how these big economic policies can have real effects on people's lives.
Exactly.
So I think the key takeaway from this book is that we need to be really careful about making simplistic assumptions about the economy.
Right.
Things are often a lot more complicated than they seem.
Yeah, and we need to be really hard-headed about the facts, like they say.
Exactly.
And skeptical of easy answers.
Yeah. So I guess the final thought for our listeners is, what other economic debates might benefit from this kind of rigorous evidence-based approach?
Right.
What other areas are we maybe oversimplifying or not really thinking about all the nuances?
Exactly.
And if you're interested in exploring these issues further, I definitely recommend checking out Good Economics for Hard Times.
It's a great book.
It is.